acknowledging the Turrbal and Jegera people as traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of everyone here, I would like to pay respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands from which you join us today. Thank you, and welcome to the inaugural lecture in the 2023 Plants, People and the Law lecture series. It's great to see so many old friends in the audience tonight. Thank you for joining us. One of the aims of the lecture series is to bring together some of the most important intellectual figures of the last 40 years working on plants in a legal context. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work happening currently in the area. We've been running for 2 years now, and I'd like to thank Dr. Hamish MacDonald for setting us up in the first year with a fantastic series of lectures, which you can find recordings of on the lecture website. You can also find details of the next 3 lectures coming up in the series this year. Please do join us. A couple of points of housekeeping. The first thing to say is if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. We'll do our best to get to some of them after the talk. If the Q&A or chat functions fail, please use my email, bcharnley@uq.edu.au. You should have that in the registration details for the event today. In today's lecture, we've gone back to the beginning of the modern debate about plants and the law. It's not often that one gets to hear directly from history-making figures speaking about the history that they made. We're incredibly honoured to be joined today by Dr. Vandana Shiva, probably the most important activist and intellectual working in the area. Dr. Shiva has worked to define a history that many of us merely study. And to paraphrase a very senior colleague's response to the announcement that Dr. Shiva would be giving the inaugural lecture in this year's series, OMG, heart, heart, starry-eyed emoji, starry-eyed emoji. I think we can all agree that Dr. Shiva's work causes a great deal of excitement and passion, and that's another element of why we are honoured to be joined by her today. That's enough from me, I think. If you would like to find out more about Dr. Shiva's work, please seek out the film Seeds of Vandana Shiva and have a look at the work being done at Navdanya International. Now I would like to hand over to Dr. Vandana Shiva herself, who will be speaking today on 35 years in defense of seed freedom. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Vandana Shiva.
Could I just check how long you want me to talk and how long is the Q&A if there is a Q&A?
Well, we have you for an hour, I hope. And so perhaps we could set aside 15 minutes at the end, although it's entirely up to you.
Sure, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. And thank you so much and greetings from India, from Dehradun, where we are actually celebrating a whole week of women and biodiversity. The movement we started about 25 years ago called Diverse Women for Diversity. And my own beginnings, I've grown up with plants, I've grown up in the forest, but my interaction with other people and the law really goes back to the early days of Chipko. Chipko was a movement that started in the mountain areas of central Himalaya, where I come from, because deforestation was leading to floods and landslides and disappearance of springs, and women were having to walk further and further, and the disasters were taking life. So women realized the connection between the forests and stability of soil, stability of water, and as their slogan said, these are not timber mines. These are sources of our soil, our water, our breath. And initially, it was just a movement. But when a really big disaster in 1978 took place, when a mountainside was logged and the entire slope slipped into the Ganges, formed a lake of 4 miles long, which when it burst, the floods went all the way to Calcutta. That's when the government realized that the women were wrong, that forests are water. And forestry shifted from being an extractive legal system to a conservation system, that the forests of the high Himalaya have to be protected for their role in soil and water. And my next interaction with plants and people goes back to the days of the Green Revolution, when 1984, the state of Punjab, where the Green Revolution was first applied, it erupted in violence. This is also where I'd done my MSc honors in particle physics. And I knew a very, very different Punjab when I was studying from what the newspapers were now telling me. So I decided to study what went wrong. After all, the Green Revolution got a Nobel Peace Prize. So why was there violence and war? Why were 15,000 people killed? And I did a book called The Violence of the Green Revolution, read every text that is taught in agriculture. And it was quite amazing. Soils were defined as empty containers for pouring fertilizers into. Plants were defined as machines for run on fuel that is fertilizer. And for me, plants are the ultimate sentient beings. We've only been around 0.1% of the time. 99.9%, the planet has been shaped and created by microbes and plants. And the planet was made livable by the process of photosynthesis by microbes and plants. And yet, even though the mechanistic philosophy, the idea of classical mechanics of discrete particles separate from each other, totally determined, totally predictable, it had been shed 100 years ago by quantum thinking. And I had chosen to do my PhD on hidden variables and non-locality in quantum theory to go deep into the quantum worldview. Biology was shifting more and more into mechanistic paradigms. And none of this happened by accident, and none of this happened as a participatory democratic evolution of society. There's a very, very good book by a historian of science called Lily Kay, who's written the history of how molecular biology, genetic engineering replaced systems biology, development biology, evolutionary biology, biology as a life sciences of living systems into a mechanical science of engineering systems. And she's worked on the Rockefeller archives and shown that the scientists who had been working in Nazi Germany when they were moved to the US under the project called Paperclip, they continued their work on looking for the determinants of biological determinism, for the atoms. Yeah, till at that time, there was no Watson and Crick, there was no identification of the DNA, but the seeking of the molecules of determinism was going on for a long time. So it's not an accident that, on the one hand, Rockefeller and Standard Oil had played a big role with IG Farben on the creation of the chemicals, first for the wars and the concentration camps, but later for the same chemicals became agrochemicals, as Rachel Carson has written, as Albert Howard has written. But the Green Revolution was also driven by them. And then the genetic engineering revolution, the entire scientific paradigm was based on that idea of life as a machine, as deterministic, not as self-organized. And this is what allowed then the tools of genetic engineering to develop further for a displacement. You know, the other day I was reading, the US had 2 people trained in earthworms. Darwin wrote a book on the mold, and he said that this species is central to our survival. And when human history will be written, we will then recognize that we wouldn't be around without the earthworm. There were 2 PhDs who'd studied on earthworm ecology. One was working in a post office, and one was working in a school, because the rise of genetic determinism and genetic reductionism as a machine also led to the displacement of all the sciences and knowledges of plants as living systems. And we are in a moment of resurgence right now because the fact that plants are intelligent, the fact that plants are self-organized, of course, plants are evolve, all that is now coming up again. But in the 80s, the idea of the seed as a machine was being used to create a whole new legal system. And there's no reason why I would come across this, except that because of my book on the Green Revolution called The Violence of the Green Revolution, I was invited to a conference on the emerging biotechnology called The Laws of Life. It was basically a dialogue between the chemical industry, which was trying to become the biotech industry, UN representatives, and some of us as independent scientists from around the world. The meeting took place in Geneva and Bourget. And at that meeting, that's the first time I heard about the idea of patenting life. The corporation said, we're not making enough money from chemicals. We need to genetically engineer the seeds. By then, the tools of recombinant DNA was available. The scientists who had evolved those tools had said, we know how to do it, but we don't know what the implications are. And therefore, we will call a moratorium. It's called the Asilomar Declaration of the scientists who had evolved the tools of moving genes around. And they said, we must stop because the ethical and ecological consequences to us are unknown. And yet, of course, once tools are available, they get picked up for anyone who can make profits. And the chemical industry then took these tools, but originally, no one talked about growing more food. No one talked about anything else but owning the seed. And they said, we have to do genetic engineering, because then we can claim we've made a novel organism. Then we can take a patent and intellectual property rights on it. But it's not enough to have such laws in Europe and America, because we're a small part of the world. And therefore, we must have an international treaty. That is how the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement was drafted. I must share this with you. James Enyart of Monsanto has gone on record of how deeply the TRIPS agreement is aligned to corporate interests and against the interests of nations and citizens. He said, once created, the first task of the IPC, which was a group of corporations of the rich countries, Intellectual Property Committee of the Rich, was to repeat the missionary work we did in the US in the early days, this time with the industrial associations of Europe and Japan, to convince them that a code was possible. Besides selling our concepts at home, we went to Geneva, where we presented our documents to the staff of the GATT Secretariat. We also took the opportunity to present to the Geneva-based representatives of the large numbers of countries what I have described to you as absolutely unprecedented in GATT. It's supposed to be a multilateral organization. Some governments are supposed to be shaping these laws. And here were the industry going straight to the Secretariat. Industry has identified a major problem for international trade. Farmers saving seed was a problem for international trade because the corporations had seen their monopoly. And therefore, farmers' freedom was coming in the way of their monopoly. So industry crafted a solution, reduced it to a concrete proposal, and sold it to our own and other governments. The industries and traders of the world commerce have played simultaneously the role of the patients, the diagnosticians, and the prescribing physicians. So how were they the patient? Oh my God, the farmers saved seeds. Small peasants have evolved seeds over millennia. And they're coming in the way of our monopoly. The diagnostician, oh, we'll turn the right to seed into a monopoly right, intellectual property rights. We will make the seed disappear. It'll now be intellectual property. Something that has popped up, evolution disappears, earth disappears, farmers disappears, suddenly seed has popped out of the minds of non-people. A corporation is not a person, it's got legal personhood, but it's not a real person. In any way, human beings don't pop seeds out of their head, but a fictitious personality definitely cannot pop seeds out of the head. Products of the mind, intellectual property, products of the mind. So not only did legal rights shift, an ontological shift took place in terms of how we relate ourselves to the world. And since from that day of the 87 meeting, not only did I start to save seeds, I started to defend the rights of our peasants, the rights of our national sovereignty, and monitor the companies and the industry, both on the legal front of intellectual property rights, but the legal front of biosafety. Now, and the interesting thing is that industry has a kind of a legal schizophrenia, because when it comes to owning the seed, they say, we've made something totally new. That's why it can be our property. So when property rights to life forms are claimed, it is on the basis of being new, novel, not occurring in nature. But when it comes for owners to take responsibility for the consequences of releasing GMOs, suddenly the life forms are not new. They are natural and unsafe. The issue of biosafety is therefore treated as unnecessary. And, since I've been in this work before the birth of genetically engineered products, every step, I just read out. At a point, there's a company called Gen Farm that engineered a bull called Herman. And this bull was supposed to carry a human gene for producing milk with a human protein. And the milk was to be used for infant formula. The engineered gene and the organism were quite clearly not natural. But when it comes to safety of the infant formula, on which there are huge debates, I've just recorded a message for the big gathering of people who've been defending the right of infants to breast milk and the standards to govern the advertising as well as production of infant formula, because we know that millions of children die when the false advertising makes it look like this is a breast milk substitute. So when it comes to the safety of the infant formula containing this bioengineered ingredient extracted from the udders of Herman's offspring, the same company said that it's new and therefore we have to have a patent. We're making these proteins exactly the way they're made in nature. Human proteins made in a bull, in a cow, which is an offspring of a bull, that it's exactly the same. And this false idea of substantial equivalence has actually guided all of the biosafety in rich countries. Thank goodness in my country, we have a strict biosafety law. The interesting thing is that, I became familiar with what was happening in 87, as I mentioned, and then 89 onwards, the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations started. And I played a big role in that. And I worked with governments to tell them what was happening. I said the biggest threat to biodiversity in the future will come from biotechnology. And so we managed to put in Article 19.3 in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which says that the impact of genetically modified, they shifted it with all the bargaining that takes place in UN platform. They made from GMO, it became LMO, the living modified organism. But everyone knew about a GMO. that the impact of GMOs on biodiversity and the environment have to be assessed before they're commercially released. And this is how biosafety protocols were created. I was asked by the United Nations to help write the framework, and then the Cartagena Protocol became law. President Bush walked out of the Rio Convention, the Earth Summit, without signing the Convention on Biological Diversity. He said, I won't allow my $50 billion industry, biotech industry, to be destroyed. And the minute he came back, his vice president, I think his name was Dan Quayle, if I remember right, he was asked to put out this order of substantial equivalence. And I couldn't stop laughing, because Dan Quayle had made it to the news for going to a school and not being able to spell potato. And he spelled a more complex word like substantial equivalence. And here is this unscientific claim that says, don't look, don't see, don't find, and declare safety. It's science works by observation, science works by evaluation, science works by evidence. Science does not work by blind faith. It then becomes a religion. But coming back to the relationship between plants and the intellectual property rights side of law, three aspects become very, very important. The first is that the technologies of introducing a gene, or in today's context, editing genome, they are not the creation of the organism. The organism is an autopoietic system. Yeah, all living systems, as Matura and Marella have written in their brilliant book, are autopoietic. They make themselves. And definitely the very power of reproduction into future generations of the organism, of the seed, is the very defining power of living systems. We reproduce. A machine does not reproduce. And the idea of reducing seeds to a machine, or a living life form to a machine, again, is based on a false equivalence of a very, very deep kind. And this has become, in a way, the center of the way the economy is looked at, the way trade is looked at. And I'll just, as an aside, give you two examples. One of the other consequences of intellectual property rights, especially with all restrictions removed, is that existing knowledge of people can be pirated and patented. And therefore, I wrote a whole book called Biopiracy. Yeah. Even before biopiracy started to happen, I said, if these the floodgates are opened, of course corporations will go to any country and find out what they do with biodiversity. They'll come to our villages and see that we use neem for pest control, go file a patent, something that really happened. I fought that case, but I'll come to the details of that later. Well, when the basmati was patented, I visited every ambassador in Geneva. And when I went to the American ambassador, he was very honest. He said, our future economy depends on redefining living systems as a manufacture that we make. And just like colonialism was based on defining the European culture and Christianity as the only form of civilization, and we started with you acknowledging the land and the people and the cultures. And colonialism was a denial of those rights. It was, after all, declared terra nullius, a word, legal jurisprudence that was used to appropriate the land of the Aboriginal people of Australia. First, as if they did not create, and what was the evidence that they were not creative? Because they did not leave destruction. As Cook said, but there's no destruction around. And to have destruction as an identity of being civilized, and to have working with a light footprint according to the laws of the country as uncivilized and barbarian, you can just think of all of the consequences that have flown. And the interesting thing is right now, you know, Mr. Bush had said, our culture is not up for negotiation. And what was the culture? Consumer culture. And he had basically said, we cannot change our lifestyle to protect the earth. And at one level, that's still happening, you know. It's all still about lifestyle, you know. If mobility through private mobility in cars has been part of contemporary civilization, then, let's just make the car electric rather than redesign our habitats and cities and live in ways that we can walk and cycle to every place. So our lifestyle and consumerism is not up for negotiation. Also means today's being civilized is being a heavy consumer of the earth's gifts and earth's resources, and indirectly still taking away the gifts and resources of the earth and other people in other places. I mean, look at the lithium story, look at the cobalt story, and it's still there. So living systems are complex. They're self-organized. And living systems specify their own structural changes. A self-organized system knows what it has to import and export, down to the fungi in the soil. They know what to take up, and they know what to give to the plant. And I've seen this with my own experience. After the Fukushima disaster, in 1 year, the research was showing that soil fungi were removing the radiation from the soil. 1 year after that, Fukushima, the tsunami of the Bay of Bengal, after we planted the soil fungi and salt-resistant seeds that we had given the farmers, the soil was back to its original fertility, the amazing creative power. The freedom of diverse species and ecosystems to self-organize is the basis of ecology. Ecological stability derives from the ability of species and ecosystems to adapt, evolve, and respond. In fact, the more degrees of freedom available to a system, that means the more its functions, the more a system can express its self-organization. And we've seen how as plants are modified, first with the Green Revolution, 250 species displaced for one rice and one wheat crop. But these two selected from one base, when an attack comes, the whole system collapses. Monocultures are ready-made, feasts for pests. And the more we are removing the diversity and diverse functions of every organism for our illusion of efficiency and productivity, we are creating more and more instability, including human beings. COVID was such an experience that people who were more vulnerable to COVID were the ones who had lost their immunity, the people who had cancer or diabetes, 9.2% higher risk, 7.6% higher risk. That resilience, immunity are properties of living systems. External control reduces the freedom of a system, and what works for plants works for human beings. I think it's the same. Self-organized communities are free societies. As I mentioned, Chilean scientists and Maturana have described so beautifully what the power of self-organizing system. Self-organized systems, in my learning, grow from within, shaping themselves outwards. Take a seed, plant an acorn, and you have a beautiful oak tree. You don't work the other way around. You don't put the oak tree into place. Externally controlled mechanical systems do not grow. They are engineered. They're put together from the outside with ingredients brought from everywhere, and the footprint, my 50 years of ecological work have shown, the footprint is always erased. And what is much more destructive to the environment is always presented as more efficient. And if I was to write a history of our times, I would show the long trail of hidden destruction behind every improvement we think is bringing us more efficiency. Self-organizing systems are distinct, multidimensional, because they evolved from within to be their own potential. Even, we've had 200,000 rice varieties evolved by farmers. The Green Revolution varieties, one is brought at a time, then it collapses, then another is brought at another time, and it collapses. We've had 4 crops that are genetically modified with just 2 traits: Bt toxin and herbicide resistance. And look at many qualities that, we have seeds that are salt tolerant and flood tolerant and drought tolerant. We have rices of every color under the sky, purple and green and red. We have tastes of all kinds in rice and in wheat and in every crop. And all of that diversity is then disappeared. Mechanical systems are uniform and one-dimensional. They're made for one purpose because they're made for an extractive system. Self-organized systems can heal themselves and adapt to changing conditions. Mechanical systems do not heal, they break down. And what is often talked about collapse, in my view, is looking at the world from a mechanical viewpoint and then thinking that the system is collapsing. But living systems don't collapse. Living systems evolve, adapt, and of course, with the kind of violence that's being done to the earth, a few will disappear, but new emergence also happens. And a second part of my work, besides saving seeds and learning from biodiversity, I spent a few years of my life learning quantum theory. The rest of my life has been spent learning from plants. And they have been my teachers in a very, very clear way. The miracle for me of every seed growing into its own distinctive plants. They don't get confused, unlike a GMO seed, which constantly have you told you Roundup ready. So here's Roundup, here's the Roundup for your daily dose of a diet. A seed knows what its distinctive form is. And we save, on our farm, we have 750 varieties of rice, but across India, the different community seed banks, we've created 150 community seed banks. And they hold more than 4,000 varieties of rice and thousands of other crops. But India is a Vavilov center of rice. So of course, the highest diversity is in rice, but even wheat. Albert Howard came and collected 1,500 varieties of wheat, which he took to Cambridge. We grow 250, and the ancient wheats do not cause gluten allergy. Monsanto, in fact, took a patent on our ancient wheat. That was one of the cases of biopiracy I took up. But Monsanto dropped it the minute we arrived at the European Patent Office to challenge the case because they'd taken our wheat. And it's in their patent application. It's fascinating. It's that the wheat that doesn't cause gluten allergy is an Indian wheat. So we've created seed banks, we've saved seeds, we've regenerated systems of coexistence and biodiverse farming. 12 crops together. Navdanya itself means 9 crops. And you mentioned Navdanya International, which is the international wing. But we have a Navdanya in India, which has an Earth University, where the learning, what we learn from plants, we share with you. And we offer courses in September. We offer a long course on the living seed and living soil and living food and living economies and living society. And we hope some of you will come because I take a very long part on the seed to develop the kind of question. But then you also have the seed bank. You also learn how to select and do participatory breeding and all of that. So the second part of the work, well, the first is working with community and defending common law. And even before national laws had to be changed, we declared that for us, seeds are our collective heritage. We've received them for our ancestors. We have to protect them for the future generations and their diversity and integrity. And therefore, we will not accept patents because these seeds have not been invented by Monsanto. And that is the basis on which the community seed banks as a defending of the commons of seed have grown. But I didn't stop at the level of community. I worked with Parliament, I worked with government, and we made two very distinctive laws that, in my view, been significant. We wrote an article in our Patent Amendment Act that Plant 3J excludes from patentability plants, animals, seeds, and their parts thereof. So this exclusion, Monsanto trumped around and falsely, showed the American patent and misled the Indian industry and extracted millions, pushing huge numbers of farmers into debt and to suicide. But they could not eventually take a patent. And the cases came all the way to Supreme Court. And I remember they're standing there and saying, the seed is an empty container. It's what we do to the seed that makes it a Superman. And they're all standing there and doing this and makes it a Superman. And they were still trying to push the view of seed as their invention. It hasn't worked, thank goodness. But I don't think the issue of plants and law is over because the greed of the corporations is quite limitless. And the more the knowledge spreads that seed is self-organized expression and autopoietic, and that it's a commons that we share for our lives. So Article 3J prevented patentability, but my agriculture minister invited me to write the law because we were being pressurized to write either a patent law for plants or a breeder's rights law for plants, which based on UPOV. And I had told the agriculture minister, but breeding doesn't begin with the industry. They've just come into the seed sector. Breeding begins as soon as farmers started to breed, to turn a wild plant into 200,000 rices, to turn a teosinte into hundreds of thousands of corn varieties. That's breeding. So we managed to write a law on breeders' rights and farmers' rights. And Article 39 says the farmer's right to breed, save, use, exchange, improve, develop, sell seed can never be alienated. That's the fundamental right. And this clause became very important when Pepsi sued Indian farmers. 4 Indian farmers were sued, 4 million crores, 4 crores, is 400,000 rupees for saving potato seed. Because they'd taken a breeder's right. And as soon as I saw this in the newspaper, I sent this book, and this is where I synthesized my 35 years of work on biodiversity, intellectual property, and all the laws. It's called Origin in the Indian publication, but in the US, it's called Reclaiming the Commons, Biodiversity, Indigenous Knowledge, Intellectual Property Rights. It has all of these cases. And it has that, so I sent this book to the lawyers and the judges. And they told Pepsi, you don't really have a right because you cannot alienate the rights of the farmers. And that case was withdrawn. But the third level of the work of these 35 years in service of plants has been challenging biopiracy. As I said, anticipating biopiracy is what I wrote. I did all my early thinking when I wrote Biopiracy. But then it really started to happen. In '84, after the Bhopal disaster, I started a campaign called No More Bhopals, Let's Plant Neem, because neem is a natural pest control agent. 10 years later, I find in the news, not in the news, a journal. I spent a lot of money in those days subscribing to journals to keep track. In a biotechnology journal, the world's first neem pesticide. I said, oh, my grandmother and my mother were doing nothing. They used to put neem leaves in our clothes. They used to put neem leaves in our grain. And So I asked my friends, there was no digital searches those days. I asked my friends to look for the patent and send it to me. And then we developed a legal challenge. As I made the challenge in the US, but I got a reply saying, what's your commercial interest? I said, no, we have a public interest. We don't have a commercial interest. The US Patent Office said, no, we only deal with commercial interests. We only deal with conflicts of commercial interest. But we also filed in the European Patent Office, which has a very strong public interest element. And therefore, it was accepted. In the first round, we won the case, then they appealed. And this was a challenge to a jointly held patent on neem, jointly held by W.R. Grace, big company, and the US Department of Agriculture. Now, this was the time when the US government was telling us, government has no business to be in business. But they were getting deeper into business. Even the Delta and Pineland, the Terminator patent is also a joint patent of US Department of Agriculture and Delta and Pineland, which was then bought by Monsanto. So 11 years, we challenged the neem patent and we won it. And tomorrow is International Women's Day. So we won it and it was an 8th of March. And the judges, did the hearing and then they went off for lunch break and said, come back after lunch break. And we didn't know, you don't know how much influence can be brought where. And we were 3 women who had joined hands, the head of IFARM, the International Organic Movement, the president of the Greens in European Parliament, and me. And I had taken 100,000 signatures from movements in India to file the case. I didn't file the case in my name. I filed the case in 100,000 names of Indians who were impacted. And the judges came back and just said one sentence: Happy Women's Day, you won. So tomorrow as Women's Day, I will remember and I wish you Happy Women's Day, but I also wish you a happy Holi. We then had to deal with the case of the patenting of a basmati by a company called Rice Tech, the attempt to patent wheat by Monsanto, their patent claims on melon, patent claim by Conagra, one of the big grain giants, on atta flour. Now we know what flour is, right? So atta, what is atta flour? Atta is the Hindi name for flour. So they put atta flour, and the invention, if you please, is take wheat and put it between 2 rollers and it'll come out as cracked wheat. Take the cracked wheat and put it between the rollers again and it'll come out as atta flour. And invention now in our centuries when flour has been eaten forever. So not only is biopiracy a theft of a direct kind, it is a violation of the recognition of the self-organized power of plants and living systems. And it is a theft from cultures and society and an enclosure of the commons. And that's why, for me, your series on plants, people, and the law is such an important series. I'm so happy to have been able to join you for this.
Thank you ever so much, Dr. Shiva. I'd like everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause for the best of the ability that the technology enables us. That was a fantastically provocative, insightful, and historical talk. I've made plenty of notes. I've got lots of questions myself. If anyone else has questions, if you'd like to send them through the Q&A, I can see there's 1 here, 2. I think there's going to be quite a stack of questions queuing up in a second. We'll start with a quick question, and that's from Pratap. How can the concerns of anti-GMO activists be addressed while still promoting innovation and progress in agriculture? Ooh, a quick question with a long answer, I think.
Yeah. First of all, from my experience of 30 years of GMOs in the real world, not the fictions, because when I used to have early debates in the 80s and the 90s on this question, the arguments would be, we will grow food on the moon. Literally, they say we'd grow food on the moon with this technology. We'll grow food in the Sahara Desert, and we'll grow food on toxic dumps, because they were going to have all of these traits invented. But a clumsy technology of transformation, like shooting a gene or infecting a plant with agrobacterium, the best it does, it moves single gene traits. Maybe it can stack 3 or 4 single gene traits, but all you can move is a single gene trait. So there are only few features of plants that are expressed in a gene, not in the living system. No gene just does one thing. Every gene has 20 functions. All functions have hundreds of genes. It's like an orchestra at every time. So the only traits you can add are not single gene functions of plants, but single gene toxics that you can add. That's why you have Bt cotton. That's why you have Roundup Ready corn. These are single gene traits added from the outside. They're not part of the plant organism. The second reason why it wasn't an improvement is because since plants are self-organized, now there's so much literature. For example, on plant capacity to resist pests. They send out signals. They communicate with each other. And when you put a toxin, which doesn't belong to the plant, and every cell of the plant is expressing that toxin, that plant then becomes very weak in its own inner functions. And this is again proven, I think it's a Zurich Institute that has shown how the functions of the plant for releasing its own pest control, those gene functions start to get crippled. The other reason why it wasn't an improvement is in terms of yields. The yield does not come from the engineering. It comes from the original plant material that you use to engineer. So it cannot change it more than the hybrid cotton you use to make a Bt cotton. Improvements, I think human beings are innovative. How do we have 200,000 rice varieties? How in these times of climate change can we, through participatory breeding, do amazing research, farmers and scientists, to look at what is able to adapt to extreme heat, to flooding, to salt? That is constant work humanity has done. That is constant potential that scientists can be engaged in. But the one thing that comes in the way is an intellectual property monopoly. And that's why patents must not be part of the domain of how we relate to plants. First of all, we don't invent them. Secondly, it prevents others from doing any innovative work. And third, it is an enclosure of the commons.
Thank you. I'd like to bring together a couple of the questions that have come in and add to them a part of my own thinking in terms of asking about the future. And so I would like, if you want to comment on both the future of the law and particularly things that are happening in India with the TKDL, new use of machine learning in order to enforce parts of Nagoya, new schemes for ABS. What do you see in terms of the future of the law in this area? Growing equity, better recognition for indigenous knowledge, or a trend towards stronger rights for corporations? So that's one set of questions. Where do you see the law going in the future? The second set of questions are related and hinted to here in terms of where do you see the technology going in the future? So what about the claims to new self-organizing technologies being made on the part of AI and on the part of systems biology, which is apparently a way to solve this problem of analyzing the orchestra, as you put it. So your thoughts on the future of the law, future of the tech?
Sure. In terms of future of the law, it totally depends on how strong movements are. Because governments can make a shift, but governments can be toppled very easily. Just look at the case of what's going on with Mexico. Mexico is the center of corn. They call themselves people of corn. They've passed laws on corn as their heritage. They've had a presidential decree that genetically modified corn will totally contaminate their rich biodiversity of corn. And glyphosate, of course, is killing the mixtures and diversity that allow the corn culture. For example, corn grows as milpa with beans and squash, and a Roundup Ready corn would mean the end of their culture of milpa. So they're fighting. But just read the newspapers. Just New York Times today has put out a threat again from the US to Mexico. So as long as the center stage of the US empire is patent monopolies on plants and seeds, then the force and military force of that empire will be used to impose the ontologically false, democratically, illegitimate laws of intellectual property on things that humans don't create. So we just have to grow more movements, and we have to have more interactions between movements. We won the Neem case because I joined hands with people in Europe. For one, I couldn't have flown all the time. We didn't have the resources. I didn't have the time. But alliances are extremely important, and alliances between different communities, because these issues bring together every discipline. They bring together biologists, they bring together lawyers, they bring together, all the cases of biopiracy have been partnerships between indigenous people and lawyers. Without that partnership, we could not reverse biopiracy. Where the law will go, as far as I'm concerned, my life's commitment is to reclaim indigenous knowledge and biodiversity as a commons protected, not as an open access commons of the Garrett Hardin tragedy, but as the protected commons governed by local communities interacting with other local communities. This is one reason why access and benefit sharing has gone crazy, because the corporations find one, I'll give you an example, and it's linked to Nagoya. There's a maize in Mexico that has the power to fix atmospheric nitrogen directly through the leaves, not through the roots. And some scientists have worked on it. Those scientists then sometimes got involved with corporations. And they took a patent. They found one man to sign an agreement. I give you permission. But there are millions of farmers. So the prior informed consent can't be of either one individual or just one community. It has to be with every member of every community that is a custodian of that resource. Another point for reason why this is so important is if we look at today, where is the biodiversity today? Is it in the conservation parks where people were driven out and are still being driven out? Or is it where indigenous people with care and knowledge protect the biodiversity? 80% biodiversity is on 20% land where indigenous people are. And I've repeatedly said, wild is not the absence of people. Wild is the absence of destructive colonizing cultures, but the presence of cultures that live according to the law of the country, law of the land, law of the biodiversity, law of nature. So reclaiming, shifting from the paradigm, the colonizing mechanistic paradigm of humans as masters, creators, owners, to us as members of the earth community, which is what all indigenous people uphold, which in law then means commons on the one hand and community rights on the other. And when the whole intellectual property thing was happening, I remember we drafted a whole law on common rights. And that's what I used to take to Parliament and government. Of course, they never implemented it in full force, but we have it in our forest rights law, that intellectual property rights belongs to the community as a whole. And I was asked to help write that law too. So on the legal front, the only way we will inhabit this earth in a way that can sustain life, we will have to come to humility. We will have to give up the anthropocentric arrogance, which is the basic foundation of intellectual property on living systems that you don't create. It's the same illusion of mastery. So to me, the commons is the only way to the future. And for that, we do need, because so many of my very, very dear friends who are in the environment movement, but have no idea of how agriculture works, how plants work, they're very good campaigners. They all slip into the propaganda of the industry, because the only test you have is the plant itself. The only test you have is indigenous knowledge. If you don't have that, there's no ground through which you can assess. Your assessment ground disappears. And I do think we need a very, very, as far as the dominant system is concerned, it looks radical. As far as the majority population of the world, which is indigenous, which is peasants, which is farmers, which is women, we look at it from there, then that's the majority thinking. So we need to shift to the majority thinking with all its diversity. The second was on the issue of technology.
Exactly.
I think for technology, I've always, let me share this with you, because I did a whole thing on it. Sorry, can't find the book. But, when I left academia and I created the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, I realized that, the first colonialism was use Christianity as the civilizing mission, as the base. Are you a Christian or not? If you're not, you're a barbarian, and you can either be slaughtered or converted or whatever is the right way to deal with you. And in our times, technology, which is supposed to be a tool, this pen is a tool, but this pen is also a tool. And when I use tools, I assess their functionality. I prefer this one to this one. This writes with more flow. I assess the ecological footprint. What does it cost the earth? What did this tool cost the earth? And I assess not just the use I have of it, but what does it mean in terms of democratic freedoms of the people? Now, pen doesn't take away freedoms, but there are some technologies that do. A Roundup Ready crop, whether it's patented or not, is destructive of the biodiversity of plants. That's what it's designed to do. In the negotiations of the Convention on Biodiversity, the Monsanto president used to get up constantly and say, we have a technology that has the power to kill everything green. Now, to stand up and be proud of that declaration. So the key to technology is it's being used as a religion today. Oh, here's technology. But technology by itself is an empty phrase. A technology for this, made with this. If you don't give me that full phrase, you're talking an empty sentence. Tool, tool, tool. Would you say tool, tool, tool? A technology is merely a tool. Do you go around the world shouting, I got a tool, I got a tool, I got a tool? No. So technologies must be brought to where they are meant to be, as tools to perform functions, not destroy the earth, not destroy freedoms of people, and enhance capacities. So technology assessment goes hand in hand with technology. As long as people are not participating and deciding what works at the societal level for them, we will have what one can say, we will have the use of technology as religion, as an instrument of control and an instrument merely of extractive profits. So I do think we need to stop centering discourse on technology, start centering discourse on the earth systems and living systems, and see technology as something that has to be assessed for its impact. That's why we have a biosafety protocol. Earlier, the industry was just selling biotechnology as biotechnology, the miracle for the future. But now it's been contextualized, and the fact that gene editing is being pushed so hard, even though it is as indeterministic as genetically engineered transgenics. One change in one gene at the editing level is leading to consequences of destabilization of 1,500 genes. An editing of a bull to be made hornless is leading to bacterial infections in the bull. I would suggest you look at the literature to see just how many are the unintended impacts these technologies have. So I do think we need very seriously to work from the plant outwards. Yeah. What does it do for the plant? And what does it do for communities, earth communities related to plants, deriving their livelihoods from plant, growing their needs from plant? And this becomes even more important because we are at this strange threshold where those who would like to see a world without farmers, without people, those who would like to see food without farms. But of course, there'll be no food without farms for the simple reason, even lab food will require huge amounts of feedstock. And the Monsantos and Bayers are ready to grow more commodities. And as I've said, to grow raw material of carbohydrates and proteins. So the minute you've converted agriculture as the cultivation of care and the cultivation of plants into the production of raw materials for labs, you've already taken away the integrity of the plants and the systems that would grow around them and with them.
Thank you so much. I think on that call to recenter the plant, we've just gone over the hour, and so maybe that's a nice point to leave things. I don't want to impose on your time any further.
Thank you so much.
That was a fantastically insightful talk. Yeah. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your thoughts with us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.